Have you ever, felt like you were being played? Like someone was kind of pulling your strings without you even realizing it? It's a creepy thought, right? Well, today we're going to do a deep dive into the world of dark psychology. And you know what? It's not just the stuff of horror movies. I think it's way more common than we realize. Like, think about it. Ever seen those ads that seem to know exactly what you're thinking? Or how about that friend who always manages to get their way no matter what? Yeah, there might be a little sprinkle of dark psychology going on there. But don't worry, this deep dive isn't about turning us all into some paranoid detectives. It's more about like understanding these tactics, you know, so we can protect ourselves and make better choices. So, what is dark psychology anyway? Well, it's basically the study of how people can use like psychological tactics to manipulate others. And they exploit those people for their own gain. And you know, the thing is, these tactics can be so subtle. Like they fly under the radar until, bam, you're caught in their web. Oh, okay. Before I forget, I got to tell you about this crazy story I read. It was about this woman who met her like dream guy online.
You know, he was charming, attentive, like the perfect Prince Charming. But get this, the whole thing was a scam. He used classic love bombing tactics, showering her with affection just to gain her trust. And he even started talking about, their future together, building this whole fantasy. But yeah, there was a catch. By the time she realized what was happening, she had lost everything, her savings, her business, everything. It's tragic, right? It really shows how these tactics can be so effective, especially when they prey on our deepest desires. Like, the longing for love and connection. The thing is, we all have vulnerabilities, whether it's loneliness, insecurity, or even just wanting to be liked. And you know what? Manipulators are experts at sniffing these out. It's like sharks sensing blood in the water. It's kind of scary when you think about it like that. For example, I used to work with this guy. Super smooth talker, always knew what to say to impress the boss. I remember one time there was this huge project, and of course he wanted to lead it. So what does he do? He starts subtly undermining our other colleague, planting seeds of doubt, trying to make him look bad in front of the boss. It was masterful. Well, in a twisted kind of way. And the worst part is he got away with it. It's crazy how calculating some people can be. But the scariest part, well, I think this dark side exists in all of us to some degree. I mean, we've all been tempted to bend the truth a little, right? Or maybe take advantage of a situation to get ahead. I know I have. The key, I think, is to be aware of these darker impulses and you choose not to act on them. Think about those like too good to be true schemes. You've heard of those Ponzi schemes. They prey on people's desire to get rich quick. They use like fake testimonials and promise these huge returns, but it's all smoke and mirrors, leading to financial ruin for so many people. I actually knew someone who got caught up in one. They thought they were going to be rolling in dough, living the dream, but they end up losing their life savings. It's a good reminder that we can't believe everything we see, and sometimes that desire to believe can actually blind us to the truth. Mm-hmm.
And speaking of things that can blind us, let's talk about social media. I think it's like a breeding ground for dark psychology.
This constant pressure to present this perfect life,
Chasing likes and followers, it can really mess with your head. You start comparing yourself to these like curated images and start feeling inadequate, maybe even a little jealous. And the worst part is the algorithms are designed to keep you hooked. They feed you more and more of what you crave, even if it's toxic. I've definitely fallen into that trap myself, spending way too much time scrolling, feeling anxious and disconnected. It's like a digital drug, and it's hard to break free. But hey, here's the good news. The more we understand about these tactics, the less power they have over us. It's like if you shine a light on the shadows, they can't hide anymore. We can start to recognize those red flags, those little cues that tell us something's not quite right. And the best part, well, we can actually learn how to build up our defenses, and then we're less susceptible to being manipulated. So speaking of defenses, let's talk about self-deception for a second. This is where we get really good at fooling ourselves. We rationalize bad decisions, tell ourselves it's not that bad. We might even blame others for our own mistakes. It's like we're wearing blinders, blocking out the truth. I'm sure we've all been there at some point, right? Like, staying in a dead-end job for way too long, or maybe sticking with a relationship that's clearly going nowhere. Oh, I totally remember this one time I was working on this project, and it was just a nightmare. The client was so demanding, the deadlines were impossible, and I was just completely burned out. But kept telling myself, just push through, it will be worth it in the end. Classic self-deception, right? Well, guess what? It wasn't worth it at all. The project flopped, and I was left feeling exhausted and totally demoralized. It's amazing how we can convince ourselves of things that aren't true, even when the evidence is staring us right in the face. But the longer we stay in denial, the deeper we get stuck. It's like quicksand. The key is to be honest with ourselves, to acknowledge those uncomfortable truths, and then take steps to change the situation. Okay, before we move on, I think we need to talk about some of the specific tactics that these master manipulators use. Do you know what they say? Knowledge is power. The more we understand their playbook, the better we can defend ourselves. One really common tactic is gaslighting. This is where someone tries to make you doubt your own sanity, your memories, your perception of reality. It's incredibly insidious, and it can be really damaging. Actually, I had a friend who went through this with her ex-boyfriend. He would constantly twist her words and deny things that had happened. Eventually, she started to question her own sanity. It was heartbreaking to watch. Another tactic is guilt tripping. We all know that one, right? It's that feeling of obligation. That pressure to do something you don't really want to do because you don't want to let someone down or make them upset. Manipulators are experts at playing the victim, making you feel responsible for their happiness, their success, even their failures. It's a powerful way to control people, and it can be hard to resist, especially if you're a people pleaser, like me. Oh, and let's not forget playing the victim card. This one's a classic. It's all about deflecting blame, garnering sympathy, and avoiding accountability at all costs. Manipulators often present themselves as helpless, wronged, or misunderstood,
Even when they're the ones pulling the strings. It's a way to manipulate others into feeling sorry for them, doing things for them, even defending them. And you know what? These tactics aren't always used with bad intentions. Sometimes people might be using them unconsciously, without even realizing it. But that doesn't make them any less harmful. The impact is still very real. So how can we protect ourselves from these tactics? Well, I think awareness is key, right? The more we understand these tactics, the better we are at recognizing them. And that's when they're being used on us. We also need to trust our gut. If something feels off, if someone's words don't match their actions, or you just get a bad vibe, don't ignore it. Our intuition is usually trying to tell us something important. And finally, setting boundaries is crucial. Learning to say no, standing up for yourself, and protecting your own well-being. Manipulators often prey on people who are afraid to speak up or who have really weak boundaries. So yeah, dark psychology can be a bit of a bummer, right? But remember, this isn't about becoming cynical or distrustful of everyone we meet. It's about empowering ourselves, about becoming more aware. And, navigating the world with a little more savvy. You know what else? Sometimes the most important person we need to protect ourselves from is ourselves. Our own self-deception, our own negative thoughts, our own limiting beliefs. These things can be just as damaging as any manipulator out there. So be kind to yourself, practice self-awareness, and always remember that you are worthy of love, respect, and healthy relationships. So we talked about some of those tactics, right? But how do we actually spot them in real life? I mean, let's be real. Most manipulators aren't walking around, twirling their mustaches and cackling evilly. It's much more subtle than that. They're often really charming. They might even seem super helpful. So we really got to be able to read between the lines. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
One thing I always watch out for is inconsistencies. Does what someone says actually match up with what they do? Do they say one thing and then totally do another? I had this friend, right? She was dating this guy who was all about those grand gestures, flowers, fancy dinners, the whole 9 yards. But when it came to the everyday stuff, being supportive or even just listening, he was totally MIA. It was all for show. And those inconsistencies, they can be a big red flag. Another thing to watch out for
is when someone tries to isolate you from your support system,
Hmm.
from your friends and family. They might make you feel like they're the only one who truly gets you, or that your loved ones are like trying to hold you back or something. This is a classic tactic that abusers and cult leaders use. It's all about gaining control. Remember that story I told you about earlier? About that woman who lost everything to an online scammer? Well, one of the things he did was convince her to cut off contact with her family and friends. He would tell her they were just jealous of their relationship and trying to sabotage it. And by the time she realized what was happening, she was totally isolated and dependent on him. It's scary, right? And speaking of scary thoughts, let's talk about the lies we tell ourselves for a minute. Because sometimes the biggest obstacle to breaking free from manipulation is our own self deception. You know, we tell ourselves that the situation's not that bad, or maybe we're overreacting, or that things will magically get better if we just try harder. It's like that saying, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. Yeah. We are so good at convincing ourselves of things that just aren't true. I mean, think about all the times we've stayed in jobs that we hated, telling ourselves it's only temporary, or I'll find a new job next month, and the next month turns into next year. And before you know it, you're totally stuck in a rut. Or how about those relationships that are clearly toxic? But we just keep clinging on, hoping that things will change. We make excuses for their behavior. We blame ourselves for their unhappiness and convince ourselves that, love conquers all, but love doesn't conquer all, especially when it's mixed with manipulation and control. So, how do we actually break free from this cycle of self deception? Well, first, we have to be honest with ourselves. We got to stop making excuses, and we have to face the truth, even if it's painful. I remember when I finally realized I was in a dead end job. It was a tough pill to swallow, but it was also liberating. Once I acknowledged the truth, I could finally start taking steps to change my situation. I updated my resume, I started networking, and eventually I landed a job that I actually enjoyed. And the same goes for relationships. If you're constantly feeling drained and unhappy, or like you're walking on eggshells all the time, it might be time to, reevaluate the situation. Of course, breaking free from manipulation isn't always easy. It definitely takes courage and self-awareness and a willingness to set boundaries. But trust me, it's so worth it. One of the most empowering things we can do is learn to just say no. It can be really uncomfortable at first, especially if you're used to, people pleasing. But setting boundaries is crucial. It's how we protect our well-being. I remember this one time I was asked to take on this huge project at work, and it was way outside of my job description. And I was already feeling super overwhelmed, but I was afraid to say no. I didn't want to disappoint anyone or seem like I wasn't a team player. But then I realized that I was the one who was going to suffer if I took on too much. So I took a deep breath and I said no. And guess what? The world didn't end. In fact, my boss actually respected me more for standing up for myself. And that's the thing about boundaries, right? They're not selfish. They're about self-preservation. It's about protecting our time, our energy, and our emotional well-being. So if you're feeling pressured to do something that you don't want to do, or if someone is constantly crossing your boundaries, don't be afraid to speak up. You deserve to be treated with respect, and you have every right to say no. Now, I know all this talk about manipulation and dark psychology can be a bit heavy. So let's switch gears for a second and talk about some of the more positive aspects of human psychology. Because, for every dark tactic out there, there's an equally powerful force for good. Think about things like empathy, compassion, and kindness. These are the qualities that make us human, that connect us to each other, and that inspire us to act with integrity. And you know what else? We all have the potential to cultivate those qualities within ourselves. It might take a little bit of effort, some self-reflection, and a willingness to challenge our own biases, but it's so worth it. Because when we choose to act with empathy and kindness, we not only make the world a better place, but we also strengthen our own resilience against manipulation. We become less likely to fall prey to those who would exploit us, and more likely to attract people who share our values of authenticity and integrity. So yeah, the world can be a really messy, complicated place, full of both darkness and light, but ultimately the choice of how we navigate it is up to us. We can choose to focus on the negative, become all cynical and distrustful, or we can choose to cultivate our own inner strength, embrace our empathy, and build meaningful connections based on trust and respect. And you know what? I truly believe that the more we choose the path of light, the brighter the world becomes. And with that, I want you to take a moment to reflect on what we've talked about today. What are some of the key takeaways that really stood out to you? What are some of those red flags you're going to be more aware of from now on? And most importantly, what are the steps you can take to strengthen your own resilience against manipulation? Because remember, knowledge is power. And the more we understand about how complex human behavior is, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the world with confidence and authenticity.
So, we've talked about a lot today, haven't we? From all those sneaky tactics to self-deception. It's almost enough to make you want to lock yourself in a bunker and never talk to another person again, right? But wait, before you go full hermit mode, let's talk about why actually understanding all this dark psychology stuff can be a good thing. Because, like they say, knowledge is power. Think about it this way. Imagine you're walking through a jungle and you know that there are poisonous snakes hiding everywhere. Pretty scary right there. But if you know exactly what to look for, you're less likely to get bitten. You can spot those telltale signs and avoid danger. And it's kind of the same with dark psychology. Once you know the red flags and you understand the tactics, well, you can navigate, the social world with more confidence, and you're less likely to get played. Remember that online gaming community case we talked about? The one that turned deadly? Well, it turned out there were a bunch of subtle signs that something wasn't right. Like the leader was always isolating members from their families and friends, making them dependent on him. And he was constantly playing the victim,
Blaming everyone else for his problems and manipulating people into feeling sorry for him. Looking back, it's so clear those were all classic signs of a manipulator. But here's the thing. If those people had known what to look for, if they had understood the dangers of, manipulation, maybe they could have avoided that whole tragedy. And that's why it's so important to talk about these things, to raise awareness and to give ourselves and each other the knowledge we need to protect ourselves, because we all have a responsibility to protect ourselves and each other. It's like that saying, right? If you see something, say something. If you notice that someone is being manipulated or exploited, don't be afraid to speak up. You might actually end up saving them from a lot of pain. And remember, this isn't just about protecting ourselves from, like those evil masterminds out there. It's also about recognizing how we might be manipulating ourselves. Those little self-deceptions, the ones that keep us stuck in those same unhealthy patterns. I remember this one time I was dating this guy, and oh my gosh, it was such a mess. He's so emotionally unavailable, always hot and cold. And he always put his own needs before mine. But I kept telling myself, oh, he's just going through a rough time, or he'll eventually change. I just know it. Ugh. Classic self-deception, right? Well, it took me way too long to realize that I was actually the one holding on to this fantasy, like a version of him that just didn't even exist. And the more I clung to that fantasy, the more I was just hurting myself. So how do we actually break free from these self-imposed traps? Well, it all starts with self-awareness, I think. It's about being really honest with ourselves about what we're feeling and what we want. And it also takes a lot of courage, the courage to challenge our own beliefs and to make choices that are truly aligned with our values. It's like they always say, the truth will set you free. But sometimes the truth can be kind of uncomfortable.
Right.
It might require us to let go of old patterns that aren't serving us anymore. We may have to step outside of our comfort zones. And we definitely have to face those fears that have been holding us back. But you know what? The rewards are totally worth it. Because when we actually live in alignment with our truth, when we're not playing those mind games with ourselves, that's when we open ourselves up to, like a whole new level of freedom and authenticity and joy. So yeah, dark psychology can be a pretty wild ride, full of twists and turns. And sometimes it can feel like we're totally lost in this maze of, manipulation and deception. But remember, we always have a choice. We can either stay lost, give in to the fear and cynicism, or we can choose to find our way out, to embrace our inner strength, and to live a life that is true to ourselves. So that's it for our deep dive into the world of dark psychology. I hope you found it insightful, maybe even a little bit empowering. Remember, knowledge is power, and the more we understand about human nature, the better equipped we are to navigate this crazy world. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay true to yourself.